My half-sister showed up at my wedding uninvited, announcing she was our father's real daughter and demanding I give her my inheritance. She screamed that I was just the bastard child who stole her life. I calmly walked to the microphone and said, "Since we're sharing family secrets, let me tell everyone about the DNA test." Then I revealed she wasn't even related to us. My name is Elena, and this story begins long before I existed, with decisions made by people who thought they could bury the truth forever. My father, Richard Morrison, was a successful architect who met my mother, Carmen, when she was working as a translator at an international construction conference in 1995. Their romance was passionate but brief, lasting only 6 months before Carmen discovered she was pregnant with me. What made the situation complicated was that Richard was already married to a woman named Victoria, and they had been trying to have children for several years without success. When Carmen told Richard about the pregnancy, he was faced with an impossible choice: leave his wife for a woman he had known for 6 months, or find a way to be part of his child's life while maintaining his existing marriage. Richard chose a third option that would haunt our family for decades. He convinced Carmen to move to a different city and promised to provide financial support while keeping his paternity secret from his wife. Carmen, who was young and didn't have family support in the United States, agreed to this arrangement, believing that Richard would eventually leave Victoria and they could become a proper family. I grew up knowing that Richard was my father but understanding that our relationship had to remain hidden. He visited regularly, provided generous financial support, and was genuinely involved in my life, but always under the cover story that he was Carmen's employer and friend who had taken an interest in helping a single mother. Carmen never married or had other serious relationships, essentially putting her life on hold while waiting for Richard to fulfill his promises about leaving Victoria. The deception became more complex when Victoria became obsessed with having children and began pursuing expensive fertility treatments. After years of failed attempts, she and Richard decided to explore adoption. That's when Victoria's sister, Margaret, offered what seemed like a perfect solution. Margaret had been living in Europe for several years and claimed to have connections with international adoption agencies. She told Victoria and Richard about a young woman in Romania who was pregnant and looking for American parents to adopt her baby. The story was compelling. The birth mother was educated but facing financial hardship, and she wanted her child to have opportunities she couldn't provide. What Victoria and Richard didn't know was that Margaret had invented this entire story. There was no pregnant woman in Romania, and Margaret had no connections with legitimate adoption agencies. Instead, she had been following Richard's visits to our city and had discovered his relationship with Carmen and me. Margaret saw an opportunity to solve her sister's fertility problems while potentially profiting from the deception. Margaret approached Carmen with a proposal that was both shocking and tempting. She offered to pay Carmen a substantial sum of money in exchange for allowing Victoria and Richard to adopt me, with the understanding that Carmen would disappear from our lives forever. Margaret presented this as an opportunity for me to grow up in a wealthy, stable home with both parents, while Carmen could start over with enough money to build a new life elsewhere. Carmen was torn by this proposal. She wanted what was best for me, and she had grown tired of the uncertainty and secrecy surrounding my relationship with Richard. Margaret convinced her that Richard would be happier if he could raise me openly as his adoptive daughter rather than continuing the deception about his paternity. The plan that Margaret orchestrated was elaborate and required the cooperation of several people who were willing to falsify documents and create a fictional backstory. Carmen was persuaded to sign adoption papers that would transfer custody to Victoria and Richard, while Margaret arranged for fake documentation showing that I had been born in Romania and abandoned by my birth mother. I was 3 years old when this transition happened, old enough to remember Carmen but young enough to adapt to calling Victoria Mom and believing the story about being adopted from Romania. Carmen received her payment and disappeared from our city, with the understanding that she would never contact Richard or attempt to see me again. For Victoria, the adoption was a dream come true. She finally had the child she had desperately wanted, and the story about rescuing an orphan from poverty made her feel noble and generous. She threw herself into motherhood with enthusiasm, documenting every milestone and achievement as proof of her successful parenting. Richard found himself in an ethically impossible situation. He was raising his biological daughter as his adoptive daughter, maintaining a fiction that required him to deny my true parentage even to me. He and Victoria never told me the details of my adoption, only that I had been chosen specially because they loved me so much. But Margaret's deception didn't end with facilitating my fake adoption. 2 years later, she approached Victoria and Richard with another proposal. This time, she claimed to have found another child who needed their help, a 5-year-old girl from the same Romanian orphanage where I had supposedly been born. This child, Margaret claimed, was actually my biological sister, and it would be a tragedy to separate us permanently. The story was designed to appeal to Victoria's desire to help children and her romantic notions about keeping siblings together. Margaret showed them photos of a beautiful little girl with dark hair and explained that the orphanage was closing and the child needed immediate placement. Victoria was enchanted by the idea of adopting another child, especially one who was supposedly my sister. Richard was more skeptical, but he found it difficult to object without revealing the truth about my actual parentage. Margaret pressured them to make a quick decision, claiming that other families were interested in adopting the girl and that delay could mean losing the opportunity forever. That's how Sophia entered our family? Sophia was indeed a real child who needed a home, but she had no connection to me or to any Romanian orphanage. Margaret had found her through legitimate adoption channels and had manipulated the paperwork to make it appear that she was part of the same fictional narrative that surrounded my adoption. What none of us knew at the time was that Sophia was actually Margaret's biological daughter, the result of an affair she had been hiding from her husband. Margaret had become pregnant while living in Europe and had given birth secretly, planning to place the child for adoption to avoid destroying her marriage. When she learned about Victoria's desperate desire for children, she saw an opportunity to place her own daughter in a wealthy family while maintaining her secret. For the next 20 years, Sophia and I grew up as sisters, believing we shared the same tragic backstory of being Romanian orphans who had been rescued by loving adoptive parents. Victoria doted on both of us, but Sophia always seemed to be her favorite. Sophia was more outgoing and charming, while I was quieter and more academic. Victoria often commented on how different we were despite supposedly being biological sisters. The family dynamic was complicated by the fact that Richard clearly favored me, though he tried to hide it. He was more involved in my education, more supportive of my interests, and more generous with financial support when I reached adulthood. Victoria interpreted this as Richard relating better to my personality, but Sophia always resented what she perceived as unfair treatment. As we became adults, these family tensions intensified. Sophia felt that I received more support and attention from our parents, while I felt that Victoria favored Sophia and that I was always trying to prove myself worthy of love. Neither of us understood the real reasons behind these dynamics, which stemmed from the complicated web of lies surrounding our adoptions. When I was 25, Richard died suddenly of a heart attack. His will revealed something that shocked everyone: he had left the majority of his substantial estate to me, with only a smaller inheritance for Sophia. The will also included a sealed letter addressed to me, which Victoria handed over reluctantly after the funeral. Richard's letter was a complete confession of the truth about my parentage and adoption. He explained that Carmen was my biological mother, that he was my biological father, and that my adoption had been arranged to hide his affair while allowing him to raise me legally. He provided Carmen's last known contact information and expressed regret about the deception that had defined my entire life. The letter also revealed Richard's suspicions about Sophia's adoption. He had become increasingly certain over the years that Margaret had lied about Sophia's background, though he had never been able to prove it. He encouraged me to investigate both adoptions to uncover the full truth about our family. Reading Richard's letter was devastating and liberating simultaneously. Everything I had believed about my identity was false, but finally understanding the family dynamics that had shaped my childhood made sense of years of confusion and hurt feelings. I decided to use the inheritance Richard had left me to investigate our family history and find Carmen. Finding Carmen took several months of detective work, but I eventually located her living under her maiden name in a city about 6 hours away. She had never married or had other children, and she had spent 22 years wondering about the daughter she had given up. Our reunion was emotional and healing, allowing me to understand the impossible situation she had faced and the sacrifice she had made believing it was best for me. Carmen provided additional details about Margaret's role in orchestrating the adoption and confirmed Richard's suspicions that the entire Romania story had been fabricated. She also encouraged me to investigate Sophia's background, warning that Margaret was capable of far more deception than we had realized. I hired a private investigator to research Sophia's adoption records and background. What we discovered was shocking. There was no record of Sophia ever being in the Romanian orphanage system, and the documentation supporting her adoption contained multiple inconsistencies and forged elements. More importantly, DNA testing revealed that Sophia was not related to me in any way, despite our supposed shared parentage. Further investigation revealed that Margaret was actually Sophia's biological mother, and that she had placed her own daughter into our family while maintaining her secret. This meant that Sophia had grown up believing she was an adopted Romanian orphan when she was actually Margaret's biological daughter being raised by her aunt and uncle. The level of deception was staggering, involving forged documents, false stories, and the cooperation of multiple people who were willing to lie to maintain the fiction. I struggled with whether to tell Sophia the truth about her parentage. She had no idea that Margaret was her biological mother, and revealing this information would destroy everything she believed about her identity and family history. But I also knew that our family had been built on lies for too long, and that Sophia deserved to know the truth about where she came from. Before I could decide how to handle the revelation, Sophia learned about Richard's letter and my investigation. Victoria had apparently told her about my inquiries into our adoption records, and Sophia became suspicious that I was trying to challenge her inheritance or her place in the family. Sophia confronted me about the investigation, demanding to know what I had discovered and why I was questioning our adoption story. When I tried to explain gently that our family history was more complicated than we had been told, she became angry and defensive. Sophia accused me of trying to prove that she wasn't really part of our family in order to claim Richard's entire estate for myself. She insisted that she was as much Richard's daughter as I was, regardless of the circumstances of our adoptions. She declared that she had as much right to his inheritance as I did and that she would fight any attempt to exclude her from the family. I tried to explain that my investigation wasn't about inheritance or excluding her, but about understanding our true family history. I offered to share the information I had discovered and to support her through whatever emotions might arise from learning the truth. But Sophia was convinced that I was motivated by greed and jealousy rather than a desire for honesty. The situation escalated when Sophia hired her own attorney to challenge Richard's will and demand a larger portion of his estate. She argued that the unequal inheritance proved that Richard had been manipulated or that his judgment had been impaired when he made his final decisions. Her attorney suggested that if there were questions about the legitimacy of our adoptions, then both adoptions should be investigated equally. This legal challenge forced me to reveal some of the information I had discovered about our family history. I shared Richard's confession about my true parentage and the evidence that our adoption stories had been fabricated. I also revealed that DNA testing had shown we were not biological sisters as we had been told. Sophia's reaction to this information was explosive. She refused to believe that Margaret was her biological mother and accused me of fabricating evidence to support my claim to Richard's inheritance. She insisted that I was lying about everything in order to paint myself as Richard's real daughter while making her seem like an outsider. The conflict between us divided our extended family and friends. Victoria was devastated to learn that both adoptions had been based on lies and that she had been deceived by her own sister. Some family members supported Sophia's right to challenge the inheritance, while others felt that Richard's wishes should be respected regardless of the complicated circumstances. As the legal battle intensified, Sophia became increasingly desperate and vindictive. She began spreading stories about me being greedy and manipulative, claiming that I had always resented her presence in the family and was now trying to erase her from our parents' legacy. She portrayed herself as the victim of my schemes, despite the fact that I had never asked for the unequal inheritance, and had only discovered the truth about our family after Richard's death. The situation reached a breaking point during my wedding planning. I had been engaged to my partner David for over a year, and we had planned a beautiful ceremony that was supposed to be a celebration of new beginnings and healing after the difficult period following Richard's death. Sophia had initially been invited to the wedding, despite our ongoing legal conflict. I had hoped that the ceremony might provide an opportunity for reconciliation and that we could find a way to move forward as family regardless of our genetic relationships or inheritance disputes. However, as the wedding approached, Sophia's behavior became increasingly erratic and hostile. She began making demands about her role in the ceremony and threatening to boycott the event if her importance to the family wasn't properly recognized. She wanted to give a speech about our sisterly bond and our shared journey as adopted children, apparently planning to use my wedding as a platform for her narrative about our family. 2 weeks before the wedding, I made the difficult decision to uninvite Sophia. Her attorney had recently filed additional legal challenges that were clearly designed to cause maximum disruption during my wedding planning, and I couldn't risk her using the ceremony to create a scene or make inappropriate announcements about our family conflicts. I sent Sophia a letter explaining that while I loved her and hoped we could eventually rebuild our relationship, I couldn't include her in the wedding given the current legal and emotional circumstances. I offered to meet with her after the ceremony to discuss our family situation more calmly. Sophia's response was immediate and furious. She called me repeatedly, leaving voicemails that alternated between tearful pleas and angry threats. She accused me of trying to erase her from the family by excluding her from this important milestone, and she threatened to disrupt the wedding if she wasn't properly included. The wedding day arrived with enhanced security, as I was genuinely concerned that Sophia might attempt to cause problems during the ceremony. The morning passed peacefully, and I began to relax as we moved through the pre-ceremony preparations without incident. The ceremony itself was beautiful, held in a garden venue that Richard would have loved. Carmen attended as my mother, finally able to claim her role publicly after years of secrecy. Victoria was there as well, still struggling with the revelations about our family but committed to supporting me despite everything that had happened. David and I had just exchanged vows and were preparing for the reception when Sophia made her dramatic entrance. She had somehow obtained information about the venue and arrived wearing a white dress that was clearly intended to upstage my wedding gown. She pushed through the crowd of guests, demanding attention and announcing that she had important information to share about the bride's family. In front of our 100 wedding guests, Sophia launched into a speech about how she was Richard's real daughter and how I had manipulated everyone into believing I deserved his inheritance. She claimed that I was just the bastard child who had stolen her rightful place in the family, and she demanded that I publicly acknowledge her superior claim to Richard's legacy. The guests were shocked and confused by this outburst, unsure how to respond to such dramatic accusations during what was supposed to be a joyful celebration. David looked to me for guidance, while Carmen and Victoria appeared mortified by the public spectacle Sophia was creating. Sophia's speech continued with increasingly wild accusations about my character and motivations. She claimed that I had forged documents, bribed officials, and manipulated DNA tests to support my version of our family history. She insisted that she was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy designed to rob her of her birthright. As Sophia's rant reached its climax, she demanded that I confess to the wedding guests that I had lied about everything and that she was the legitimate heir to Richard's estate. She seemed to believe that public pressure would force me to capitulate to her demands and acknowledge her version of our family story. That's when I decided that 25 years of lies and manipulation had gone on long enough. I calmly walked to the microphone that had been set up for the reception speeches. The crowd fell silent as I prepared to respond to Sophia's accusations. I could see the expectation in her face that I would either flee in embarrassment or submit to her demands to avoid further public humiliation. Instead, I began by thanking our guests for attending our wedding and apologizing for the disruption to what should have been a purely celebratory occasion. I explained that our family had been dealing with some complicated issues related to adoptions and inheritance, and that these conflicts had unfortunately spilled over into our wedding day. Then I told the truth. I explained that Richard had left a letter confessing that he was my biological father and that my adoption had been arranged to hide his affair with my mother. I acknowledged that this revelation had created complications regarding inheritance and family dynamics, but that I had never asked for preferential treatment and had only learned about these circumstances after Richard's death. I also revealed that extensive investigation had shown that Sophia was not actually adopted from Romania as we had been told, but was instead the biological daughter of our Aunt Margaret, who had placed her into our family while maintaining her secret. I explained that DNA testing had confirmed that Sophia and I were not related, despite growing up believing we were sisters. The most devastating revelation came when I shared the evidence that Margaret had orchestrated both adoptions through fraud and deception, using forged documents and false stories to manipulate Victoria and Richard into unknowingly adopting Margaret's own biological daughter while helping Richard raise his biological daughter as an adoptive child. I concluded by expressing love for Sophia despite our lack of genetic relationship, but making it clear that her claims about inheritance and family legitimacy were based on the same lies that had defined our family for decades. I stated that I hoped we could eventually build an honest relationship based on the reality of our situation rather than the fiction we had been raised to believe. The silence that followed my revelations was absolute. Sophia's face went through a series of expressions as she processed the implications of what I had shared. She realized that not only had her claims about inheritance been publicly debunked, but that her entire understanding of her identity had been exposed as false in front of a crowd of witnesses. Some guests began to murmur among themselves as they tried to understand the complex family dynamics that had just been revealed. Others looked uncomfortable with having witnessed such private family matters being aired in public. A few family members who had known pieces of the story nodded in recognition of details they had suspected but never confirmed. Sophia's initial response was to accuse me of lying and demand that I provide proof of my claims. When I mentioned that all the documentation and DNA test results were available for review, she began to realize that her position was untenable. Margaret, who had been invited to the wedding as Victoria's sister, was sitting in the audience looking increasingly pale as the truth about her deceptions was revealed. She had apparently hoped that her secrets would remain buried forever, but the inheritance dispute had triggered investigations that uncovered decades of lies. As the reality of the situation became clear, Sophia's anger turned to devastation. She was learning for the first time that Margaret was her biological mother, that her entire adoption story had been false, and that she had no genetic relationship to the family she had been raised to believe was her own. The wedding reception proceeded awkwardly after Sophia left with Margaret, both of them apparently needing time to process the revelations and their implications. Many guests approached me throughout the evening to express support and amazement at the complexity of our family situation. In the weeks following the wedding, the legal challenges to Richard's inheritance were dropped as it became clear that Sophia had no basis for claiming equal treatment as Richard's biological daughter. Her attorney advised her that the evidence about our respective parentage was overwhelming and that pursuing further legal action would only result in additional expenses and public embarrassment. Sophia and I have had limited contact since the wedding revelation. She has been working with a therapist to process the truth about her identity and her relationship with Margaret, who has finally acknowledged her biological parentage after years of deception. Margaret faced social and legal consequences for her role in orchestrating fraudulent adoptions. While the statute of limitations prevented criminal charges for most of her actions, she lost credibility with family and friends who learned about her decades of lies and manipulation. Victoria has been working to rebuild relationships with both Sophia and me, though she struggles with feelings of betrayal and confusion about how she could have been deceived so completely for so many years. She has expressed gratitude for finally knowing the truth, even though that truth is painful and complicated. Carmen and I have developed a close relationship as we work to recover the mother-daughter bond that was interrupted by 22 years of separation. She has been invaluable in helping me understand the family dynamics that shaped my childhood and providing context for Richard's decisions and motivations. The inheritance that caused so much conflict has been used partially to support family healing, including therapy for everyone affected by the revelations and financial assistance for Sophia as she navigates her identity crisis and relationship with Margaret. David and I have built a strong marriage based on honesty and communication, with a clear understanding that secrets and deceptions can destroy families across generations. We've committed to raising our future children with truth and transparency, regardless of how complicated that truth might be. The wedding day revelation was dramatic and painful, but it finally ended 25 years of lies that had shaped and distorted our family relationships. While the truth created short-term chaos and hurt feelings, it also provided the foundation for building authentic relationships based on reality rather than fiction. Looking back, I realize that Richard's decision to confess the truth in his letter was both selfish and generous. He avoided dealing with the consequences of his deceptions during his lifetime, but he also provided me with the information needed to understand my identity and make informed decisions about my relationships and future. The most important lesson from this experience is that family is defined by love and commitment rather than genetics or legal documents, but that relationships built on lies will eventually collapse under the weight of deception. Sophia and I may not be biological sisters, but we were raised together and shared formative experiences that created genuine bonds. The challenge now is building new relationships based on truth rather than fiction, acknowledging the pain caused by decades of deception while working toward forgiveness and understanding. Some family bonds have been strengthened by surviving this crisis, while others have been permanently damaged by the revelation of lies and manipulation. The DNA test that revealed Sophia's true parentage was the final piece of evidence needed to uncover the full scope of Margaret's deceptions, but it also provided closure for questions that had troubled our family for years. Sometimes the most painful truths are also the most liberating, freeing us from the burden of maintaining lies that never served anyone's real interests. My wedding day will always be remembered as the day our family's deepest secrets were finally exposed, but it was also the beginning of building relationships based on honesty rather than deception. The truth may have been dramatic and painful, but it was also necessary for any hope of authentic family connections moving forward.